It's a story of Russia and how Russia has changed for all this period of time.
Vladimir Putin saw himself very much in the kind of romantic tradition of Soviet spycraft. Putin thinks he's a brilliant spy.
He decided that he was going to do everything he could to crush any sort of opposition in Russia.
There is a government-operated death squad inside the security services.
This guy had that feel about him, that he was a criminal.
What threatens him is the idea of sovereignty, the idea of freedom, and the idea of democracy for Ukraine.
It's this secret mentality that everything has to be sort of behind closed doors.
За Владимира Владимировича Путина.
Angela Merkel was terrified of dogs. She had a phobia of dogs. Putin knew that.
He wants to prove that he's the toughest guy in the room.
А вы умеете прощать?
Да, но не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
Vladimir Putin has recently warned Western countries that he is prepared to use nuclear weapons in his war with Ukraine.
Это не блеф.
Did Putin always have such views? Consider these thoughts expressed long ago in this first ever on-camera interview we found deep in the Russian archives. The belief that all Russian-speaking people should be united as they were in the old Russian Empire. He blames the founders of the USSR for creating territories like Ukraine that became countries.
The Soviet leaders broke our fatherland into separate territories which had never appeared on any world maps, provided those territories with governments and parliaments, and now we have what we have.
Putin's rise to supreme power in Moscow and his attempt to rebuild the old Russian Empire would lead to his shelling of the Russian-speaking areas of Ukraine, killing thousands of the former Soviet countrymen he professed to care for. This is the story of his dark journey. On many occasions, Vladimir Putin has performed his favorite judo moves before TV cameras. At age 24, he had been the judo champion of his hometown of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. He has also spoken of judo as the thing that turned his life around when he was introduced to it as a young boy.
I did not start school until I was almost 8 years old. We still have the photo in our family archive. I am in an old-fashioned gray school uniform.
Putin grew up in poverty. His father was a factory worker. The family was assigned an apartment in a 5-story building with no elevator.
We lived in one room in a communal flat on the 5th floor, the last floor. Sometimes the ceiling leaked. These were our living conditions. We didn't even have a shower. There were hordes of rats in the front entryway. My friends and I used to chase them around with sticks. Once I spotted a huge rat and pursued it down the hall until I drove it into a corner. Suddenly, it lashed around and threw itself at me. I got a lasting lesson in the meaning of the word cornered.
Now a journalist, Konstantin Eggert grew up in similar circumstances to Putin in the same era.
I immediately recognized the type. That would have been the boy with whom my mother would not have recommended that they play in the yard. The one who would, torture cats and hit the young children.
I really was a bad boy. I was a hooligan. I got into sports when I was about 10 or 11. I decided to go into boxing, but I didn't last long there. I quickly got my nose broken. The pain was terrible. I decided to go for Sambo, a Soviet combination of judo and wrestling. It was sports that dragged me off the streets.
I think that Putin wanted to be the bully that will be, yes, eventually one of the biggest, at least in his crowd.
Putin says that another big turning point in his life came when, as a teenager, he saw the Soviet TV film series The Sword and the Shield, a heroic portrayal of Soviet spies working behind enemy lines in Nazi Germany.
Even before I graduated from school, I wanted to work in intelligence. Then, books and spy movies like The Sword and the Shield took hold of my imagination.
С тобой, с удовольствием.
What amazed me most was how one man's effort could achieve what whole armies could not. One spy could decide the fate of thousands. At least that's the way I understood it.
Putin set his sights on becoming an officer of the KGB, the Soviet secret police service that was the most powerful branch of the communist government. Australian journalist Zoya Sheftalovich was born in the Soviet Union.
I think it was quite a startling thing that someone might say that they wanted to join the KGB. It was an organization that was feared and reviled by many. It would pit neighbor against neighbor. It would set children against their parents. So it was quite astounding that that was something that he wanted. But it gave a pretty good indication of the direction of travel for Putin from seemingly a very young age.
In order to find out how to become a spy, sometime around the beginning of the 9th grade, I went to the KGB office. A guy came out and listened to me. I said, "I want to get a job with you." He said, "That's terrific, but you can come to us only after the army or after some type of civilian higher education." I was intrigued. "What kind of higher education?" I asked. "Law school."
Putin eventually made it to the Leningrad University Law Department, and sure enough, as he was about to graduate, the KGB came knocking. He was thrilled. Shortly after completing his agent training, he met Lyudmila, an airline flight attendant, and he eventually proposed. They were married in 1983, quickly had their first daughter, and he received his first foreign posting to Dresden, East Germany. They lived around the corner from the KGB offices there. He was regularly in and out of the headquarters of the Stasi, the dreaded East German secret police. This was his East German police ID card, later found in the Stasi archives. The Stasi headquarters in Dresden has been turned into a museum, where you can see the old paddy wagons that transported hundreds of dissidents that were arrested every month. The 4 floors of cells where they were detained, the rooms where they were interrogated, and the dungeons where many were tortured or murdered. Preserved here too are the photos of the young Soviet agent Vladimir Putin, who served here for 5 years. He was awarded a medal from the Stasi for his service. Hubertus Kanabe is Germany's leading historian of the Stasi. He says Putin fit the profile of someone who wanted to work for the secret police.
You have a secret organization who are like little gods, if you want to put it like that. So they could decide if somebody who walked on the street came to prison or not.
Putin worked at this KGB Dresden outpost at number 4 Angelika Strasse. There are photos of him posing behind his superiors here, and many photos of his daily life in Dresden.
You see Vladimir Putin as a young man trying to serve his higher-ranking comrades. And you can see in his face that he was not like a leading figure, more like a serving figure. I would say that Putin was not very important.
Luke Harding served as the Moscow bureau chief for the Guardian newspaper.
I think Vladimir Putin saw himself very much in the kind of romantic tradition of Soviet spycraft as someone who could join this world and thrive in this world. The problem was, I mean, he did manage to get inside, but within a decade he was not running around New York or Washington or Paris or London having the sort of adventures you might imagine from Soviet films. He was stuck in Dresden in communist East Germany, shuffling bits of paper.
In November 1989, the Soviet Empire began to crumble as the Berlin Wall came down. It was the climax of a period of mass uprisings against communist governments throughout Eastern Europe. Delirious protesters began taking down the wall with their bare hands. At first, the East German police tried to scare them away with water cannons and fire hoses, but it was no use. The police were soon overwhelmed. Within weeks, the crowds had surrounded, then burst into the Dresden Stasi headquarters. They wanted to stop the destruction of records, the evidence of those who secretly spied on and betrayed their fellow citizens. Some moved on to the nearby local KGB outpost, where they encountered Vladimir Putin at the entrance. In this first crisis of his career, Putin showed that he was willing to shoot human beings to protect some documents.
We had to show we were prepared. I even had to tell our security team to show their weapons, unfortunately, which wasn't great in my view. I had an appropriate weapon, of course. I was an officer. We were prepared to defend ourselves against the crowd, and we would have been within our rights to do so. We had documents in our building, our lists of contacts, and our agents' networks. I personally burned a huge amount of material. Those crowds were a serious threat. I called our group of forces and I was told, we cannot do anything without orders from Moscow, and Moscow is silent. I got the feeling that the country no longer existed, that it had disappeared.
2 years later, the Soviet Union would disappear, which Putin would describe as the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the century. While Putin would see the fall of the Berlin Wall and the breakup of the Soviet Union as a catastrophe, it would actually prove beneficial for his career. He would return to Leningrad, where he would use his KGB methods to advance his political ambition. Vladimir Putin now lives in opulence in the gold-encrusted Kremlin, but says he remembers the tough times in his hometown of Leningrad after the fall of the Berlin Wall, when he had to moonlight as a taxi driver.
Sometimes I had to earn extra money. I mean, earn extra money as a private driver. It's unpleasant to talk about, to be honest, but unfortunately that was the case.
Momentous change was arriving in the Soviet Union. Democratic reformers were on the march, and the KGB was trying to stop them. The agency assigned Putin to penetrate the reform movement. He offered to work as a driver and organizer for several leading figures.
I was happy to go undercover at Leningrad State University. I wanted to check out the university and perhaps get a job there.
Putin was hired as an assistant to the crusading liberal university professor Anatoly Sobchak, who became the first elected mayor of St. Petersburg. He claims that he confessed to Sobchak that he was a KGB agent and that Sobchak didn't care. Putin was eventually named deputy mayor. In those first years of democracy, St. Petersburg was being overwhelmed by chaos. There was open warfare between criminal gangs fighting for turf. There were murders every day. Putin made connections with the heads of some of the criminal gangs, theoretically to mediate the turf wars.
There have been many fairy tales about the criminal St. Petersburg, but things could get violent. At my cottage, I would sleep with my gun. Such were the times. Better safe than sorry.
He was very deeply involved with the St. Petersburg underworld of the time. Of course, he was privy to a lot of very, very dirty stuff.
Putin was becoming a political figure, and he invited a local filmmaker to start following him around to build up his image. There were rumors at that time that Putin was corrupt. Some businessmen approaching him for a license to set up new companies in the city say they were told to give a $10,000 bribe as part of their application. Putin was even asked on camera about the allegations, and he didn't actually deny it.
Вам предлагают взятки?
Ну, видите ли, во-первых, должен откровенно сказать, что такие предложения не впрямую, но следуют.
Предложения следуют, но вы их не берете.
А вы хотите, чтобы я ответил, я беру, да? Значит, если я вам скажу, что я не беру, так, то телезритель подумает, ну да, жди, скажет он тебе, что берет. Конечно, не скажет.
It would be impossible for a Russian official during this period to be Mr. Clean. It's just not how it worked. If you were Mr. Clean, then you would be removed. Putin was not Mr. Clean, he was Mr. Grubby.
Despite the notorious corruption in St. Petersburg, Putin became known as an effective can-do manager. He was brought to Moscow to serve in the presidential administration of Boris Yeltsin. His career took off. Yeltsin was so impressed with Putin that he appointed him to head the FSB, the renamed KGB security agency.
Возвращение на работу в органы безопасности – это возвращение в свой родной дом. Николай Дмитриевич начинал с младших оперативных уполномоченных. Это было 23 года тому назад.
By this time, Yeltsin was in serious decline. He had had several heart attacks and was drinking to excess. He often seemed lost and confused, and was sometimes making a fool of himself in public. Most presidential decisions seemed to be made by his daughter, Tatiana. The Yeltsin family were also the target of a major corruption investigation. Their secret Swiss bank accounts and massive credit card spending had leaked into the newspapers. The Yeltsin corruption investigation was being led by Russia's prosecutor general, Yuri Skuratov. Skuratov suddenly found himself the target of Vladimir Putin. In a classic KGB-style operation called a honey trap, a drunken Skuratov was lured into a hotel room with two prostitutes, and the ensuing threesome was filmed by hidden cameras. Skuratov was confronted with the evidence in a meeting in Yeltsin's office, attended by then-Prime Minister Evgeny Primakov, himself a former intelligence chief, and Putin.
Mr. Yeltsin took out the videotape and photos made from it. He just put them on the table and said, "I don't think you should work as prosecutor general any longer." Primakov agreed. "Yes, Mr. Skuratov, I think you had better write a letter of resignation." Yuri thought for a while. Then he took out a piece of paper and wrote that he was resigning.
After that meeting, Skuratov's friends in government rallied around him, and so he tried to rescind his resignation. Until Putin delivered the coup de grace by giving the honey trap tape to a national TV channel, where it was broadcast to millions of viewers. Skuratov was finished.
That impressed. I mean, there's nothing like bringing down a prosecutor in a public sex scandal to impress the boss, and really was almost like a kind of calling card for Yeltsin and Yeltsin's team that Putin was reliable, and he got the job done.
Yeltsin was extremely appreciative of Putin's relentless dirty campaign to defend him. His family decided that Putin was just the man to succeed Yeltsin as president and protect their interests, especially as they were still the target of corruption investigations. In August 1999, Yeltsin stunned the country with an announcement that the relatively unknown Putin was his new choice for prime minister.
Но нельзя забывать и о том, что через год, ровно через год.
He was looking for someone who was going to be unfailingly loyal And that was Putin. Putin demonstrated through the Skuratov affair and then subsequently as well through the promise that he made to Yeltsin that he would deliver immunity for him. He essentially gave Yeltsin a way out, which was not necessarily going to occur if Yeltsin had appointed someone else.
Facing an election in a few months as a complete unknown, Putin needed to build a wave of popular support fast. And so he turned to tried and true methods: patriotic propaganda and war. In Moscow, the reminders of Putin's war in Ukraine have been everywhere. On recruitment billboards, at many subway stops, even in Christmas decorations. Many believe that Putin declared this war to keep himself in power, much as he went to war in 1999 to increase his popularity heading into his first presidential election. His target was the southern Russian Republic of Chechnya, where the Yeltsin regime had been struggling for years to deal with a rebel insurgency. Suddenly, the new prime minister was on TV every night, posing as a fighter pilot, personally handling weapons, and declaring that he would crush the Chechen insurgency.
То это значит, что нам противостоит хитрый, наглый, коварный и кровожадный противник. На протяжении истории Россию многократно пытались поставить на колени и запугать. Это не удалось никому.
A month after he became prime minister, the stakes got much higher. In September 1999, a series of explosions hit 4 apartment blocks in Moscow and other cities, killing more than 300, injuring more than 1,000.
There was this real fear, this feeling that you never know what's going to happen. You don't know if your building is going to be next.
A tragic loss of life, but something didn't seem right or real. At the leading Russian TV network, famous anchorman Evgeny Kiselov was suspicious.
When I learned about the second explosion, it came to my mind immediately that this is a conspiracy to disseminate fear, and by manipulating people's fear, they are going to build a whole political campaign on it. That's what happened.
Putin immediately blamed the Chechen rebels for the terrorism. He vowed revenge.
Мы будем преследовать террористов везде. В аэропорту. Значит, вы уж меня извините, в туалете поймаем, мы и в сортире их замочим, в конце концов. Все, вопрос закрыт окончательно.
Then residents of another apartment complex saw suspicious men in the basement of their building. At first, local police said they found explosives and had foiled a terrorist mission. Then the FSB made a stunning announcement. It admitted the suspicious team were actually FSB agents and claimed they were on a training mission. Contradicting police evidence, it was claimed the explosives were actually bags of sugar. Many Russians saw it as evidence that the secret police had been behind all the explosions, a false flag operation to build support for Putin's war effort.
What? Blowing up our own apartment buildings? You know, that is really utter nonsense. It's totally insane. No one in the Russian special services would be capable of such a crime against his own people.
Абсолютно. Мне в голове не укладывается. Невероятно.
Скажите, как вы думаете, цель оправдывается?
I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming. This was an inside operation, organized clandestinely by the FSB, and it worked brilliantly because the apartment bombings consolidated support for Putin. They increased hatred towards the Chechens, and it meant that when Putin launched this sort of special operation against Chechen rebels, there was almost kind of universal support from ordinary Russians. So it was kind of foundational act.
Я ухожу.
On New Year's Eve 1999, in his annual holiday TV address, Boris Yeltsin dropped another surprise bombshell. He announced that he would be leaving his job immediately and that Vladimir Putin would be taking over as acting president.
Больше и лучше.
Soon after Yeltsin named Putin as acting president, an article appeared in a Moscow newspaper predicting Putin would become a dictator like Joseph Stalin. Remarkably, it was written by the great-granddaughter of another famous Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev.
One of the Khrushchev legacies is that we're going to tone down the KGB and elevate the party, because at least the party is not going to kill you. My mother, for example, was very upset about Yeltsin, about the chaos and corruption and crazy capitalism and drinking and how embarrassing it is. And she was saying, this cannot be worse than Yeltsin. And I said, trust me, we are going to be missing Yeltsin.
Putin called in a new team of image makers to help him prepare for the presidential election scheduled just 3 months away.
Сейчас закройте глаза, буквально секунду, расслабьтесь и очень по-доброму вот на меня посмотрите. Насколько это возможно, замечательно.
He also invited documentary filmmaker Vitaly Mansky to follow him through the critical months ahead. Mansky was apparently granted total access to Putin, accompanying him through late nights at the office, training his dog in the Kremlin courtyard, on midnight motorcades through the streets of the capital, and even to his daily swim sessions.
На меня он произвел впечатление такого очень осторожного, желающего понравиться. Наверное, это была такая форма, может быть, даже вербовки, но проверки такой, так сказать, человека, вот насколько он может быть мне полезен для какого-то продвижения.
Mikhail Kasyanov was a crusading liberal economic reformer who had served in the Yeltsin government. Putin chose Kasyanov to be his first prime minister.
We all believe that Putin is a young, energetic person and could continue reforms. Mr. Yeltsin, President Yeltsin, believed to him, and many of us also believed. I also was among those who believed that Putin was a democratically devoted person.
Election night, March 2000. Behind the scenes, Putin gathered with his campaign team, led by the young Dmitry Medvedev, his campaign manager. Also there was Yeltsin's daughter Tatiana and her future husband, whom he kept on in his administration. He won on the first ballot. At that moment, everything seemed possible for the new leader. Many believed he would change Russia for the better. American businessman Bill Browder ran the biggest investment fund in Russia.
When part of his campaign was that he was going to bring the power of the government back to the presidency, it seemed like an attractive thing to me, because the oligarchs there's 22 oligarchs who had stolen 40% of the country from the Russian people, and everyone was living in abject poverty other than these 22 oligarchs, and Putin was going to, at least in his pitch, he was going to correct that imbalance.
By the time of Putin's first inauguration as president in May 2000, his devotion to establishing a personality cult was in full flower. It was a ceremony such as Russians had never before witnessed, focusing on him as an almost godlike figure. But his presidency nearly foundered during his first months in power. Some indelible images of Putin's 25 years in power come from his vacations. Swimming in Russia's rivers, fishing, hunting, or just taking in the sun with his closest friends and ministers. In the first summer after his inauguration, Putin went off on a long family holiday, but his presidency was nearly torpedoed before it began. In August 2000, the Russian nuclear submarine Kursk lost contact with headquarters. It appeared as if it had gone to the bottom of the Barents Sea with 118 sailors on board. When the news broke, Putin decided he didn't have to interrupt his vacation to deal with the crisis. Several other countries offered to help rescue the Russian sailors marooned on the ocean floor, but the offers were rejected. Multiple Russian rescue attempts over 4 days failed. The 118 sailors perished. The victims' families were in a rage by the time Putin decided to finally end his vacation 10 days later and come to speak with them.
Я тоже себе не представляю. Для того, чтобы поднять, я и говорю ответственно. Я не могу сейчас, знаете, прийти сейчас вам наговорить и смыться отсюда. Я говорю так, как есть. Вот это тяжелая правда, но она правда.
In fact, it was not the truth. Foreign countries said they could have rescued the sailors.
When Putin was confronted by angry relatives, he didn't think these are angry relatives who are upset because their loved ones are dying or dead. He assumed, of course, this must be a provocation by his enemies, because that's the sort of paranoid way his brain works.
In a remarkable scene on national TV, a mystery woman with a hypodermic needle approaches a distraught mother raging about the death of her submariner son. The mother is injected and eventually falls unconscious. It was a strong message that dissent would not be tolerated. After this scene was broadcast, Putin phoned in to the TV network to say the complaining women were acting. The anchorman said he called them $10 whores.
Special edition of Larry King Live. It's our honor to have as our special guest for the full hour here in New York, Vladimir Putin.
The submarine scandal followed Putin on his first official visit to the United States, where he appeared as a guest on the CNN show Larry King Live.
Tell me, what happened with the submarine?
Она утонула.
It sunk.
Putin displayed such a stunning degree of cynicism and insensitivity that even Larry King was lost for speech.
What it showed was his complete, almost sociopathic lack of empathy. That for him human life is nothing, that humans are people that if need be can be tossed away.
Another incident early in Putin's regime showed how touchy he was about any criticism. Kukli was the name of a very popular Russian TV show in which devastating political satire was enacted with puppets. Vladimir Putin was often portrayed on the show as Yeltsin's ugly baby, then as an annoying little child. The portrayal really bothered Putin, got under his skin, and his advisor said he immediately threatened the owner of the NTV network that produced the show.
They say that he was just kind of running around the room, cursing and hitting the walls and the table with his fist and saying, I'm going to put him in a cell with the cellmates who suffers tuberculosis. I'm going to rot him.
One of Putin's very first acts after being elected president was to send his stormtroopers over to raid the NTV headquarters. The head of the network was arrested and eventually forced to sign away the ownership of NTV. Putin was sending a strong signal about the future of any independent media in Russia. At one point, Putin invited the senior journalists of NTV to the Kremlin and tried to convince them that nothing was really changing. They were not buying it.
He immediately became very hostile and started to accuse us of lacking proper understanding of government, of the country's national interest. Why should the government support you if you criticize it? Mm-hmm. And all kinds of that things.
How did you feel when you walked out of that meeting?
like covered in shit. I had a very bad feeling, frankly speaking, because it was obvious that this man is capable of thinking about independent media only in terms of manipulating it. So if he cannot manipulate a medium, then this medium is his enemy.
Putin decided to take over all TV in Russia and build it into the overwhelming propaganda machine it is today. Foreign leaders did not seem to notice or care.
I wouldn't have invited him to my ranch if I didn't trust him.
Back in 2001, the United States also had a new president, George W. Bush. He came to meet Putin at a summit in Slovenia, where he shared his instant judgment of his Russian counterpart.
Is this a man that Americans can trust?
When I looked the man in the eye, I found him to be very straightforward and trustworthy. We had a very good dialogue. I was able to get a sense of his soul.
Well, I think George W. Bush regrets having said that now because it's not clear exactly where Putin's soul is.
Ambassador John Bolton served in the Bush administration and met Putin numerous times.
But it was indicative of the optimism that we felt that the Cold War was over, that we could find a way to bridge the differences and work together against what we saw as common threats. I think in retrospect, we badly misjudged Putin.
It was not only the Americans who seemed to fall under the Putin spell. On a visit to the United Kingdom in 2003, Putin was given the royal treatment, touring London beside the Queen in a horse-drawn carriage. It was a shock to the Russian dissident journalist Vladimir Kara-Murza.
In June of 2003, literally on the same week that Vladimir Putin's government pulled the plug on the last independent television channel in Russia, he was treated to a lavish state visit to London and a ride with the Queen of England. It was clear from the very beginning. And yet, so many leaders of Western democratic countries deliberately chose to turn a blind eye on all these domestic authoritarian abuses.
Back in Moscow in 2002, Vladimir Putin was building an elaborate corruption scheme. The beneficiaries were often his old pals, like his longtime judo partner Arkady Rotenberg, who was becoming obscenely rich, along with Putin's St. Petersburg friends, who were all on the path to becoming billionaires. The level of Kremlin corruption was offensive to Russia's richest man, Mikhail Khodorkovsky. He had built Yukos, a wildly successful oil company, and was well connected to international business and political leaders. He thought that gave him some protection, and so he took the fateful decision to confront Putin about corruption at a televised roundtable discussion.
Мы экспертами 4 организаций приблизительно одинаковые, в районе 30 миллиардов оценивается долларов.
In that famous meeting, Putin reacted to Khodorkovsky's criticism with a threat.
Надо отдать должное руководству компании ЮКОС. Так? Она договорилась с налоговой службой, приняла все
Prime Minister Kasyanov was sitting beside Putin at the meeting and was alarmed by Putin's threat.
After this meeting, I came together with Putin to his room and said, you're absolutely wrong, you shouldn't do this. He said, no, you don't know. And Putin said, General Prosecutor knows what to do, stop all this criticism.
Khodorkovsky's confidence was misplaced. Putin had him arrested and dragged before a court. He was subjected to what could only be described as a show trial, but was often seen smiling and laughing during the court proceedings.
It was a complete theater of the absurd. This demonstrated that the regime didn't even have an interest in pretending that these proceedings were real court proceedings, That was their wish.
Что касается Ходорковского, считаю, что вор должен сидеть в тюрьме.
It was demonstration of example for other big owners of properties that if you don't agree with the general line of the president, that what will just your destiny will go this way.
Businessman Bill Browder had a different view. He thought Russia would be better off without the old oligarchs.
I was cheering. I thought, okay, one down, one oligarch down, 21 oligarchs to go. I thought it was a great thing. Turned out that he was the only oligarch he took down.
After the show trial, Khodorkovsky was found guilty of tax crimes and sentenced to 14 years. His financial empire was dismantled, and the pieces were grabbed by Putin's friends.
It was a very powerful signal that no one is immune from Putin's wrath. And that's why we've seen very, very little resistance since then to anything that Putin did. So in many ways it was a masterstroke.
It was clear that Putin's alliance with liberal reformers was at an end. Mikhail Kasyanov resigned as prime minister and joined the opposition ranks. Vladimir Putin would go on to become much more aggressive in dealing with perceived enemies, domestic and foreign. Today, the city of Mariupol, like much of eastern Ukraine, lies in ruins, laid waste by Russian bombing. This is the result of Putin's long obsession with Ukraine. An obsession that dates back to the Ukrainian election of 2004. This was a time of hope in the country. A vibrant young candidate for president, Viktor Yushchenko, was leading a pro-Western movement. Putin came to campaign on behalf of the pro-Russian candidate, Viktor Yanukovych. In a TV interview on every Ukrainian channel, he emphasized that he respected the independence and borders of Ukraine.
Это не что иное, как полное и абсолютное признание независимости и уважения независимости Украины. Не только по сухопутной, но и по морской границе.
Adrian Karatnitsky worked closely with several Ukrainian presidents.
This whole effort, this charm offensive designed to bolster Yanukovych, presenting this guy as a real, powerful, respected ally of a great power. And so Putin played that role in this political theater.
The first dramatic election development came when the pro-Western candidate, Yushchenko, was poisoned with dioxin. He nearly died and was left with a badly disfigured face. Suspicions fell on Russia. Then, after a dubious vote count, it was announced that the pro-Russian candidate had won. Putin quickly recognized his friend Yanukovych as president. But there was an immediate uprising in the streets called the Orange Revolution. The Supreme Court threw out the rigged election result, and in the revote, Yushchenko emerged as the clear winner. It was a major embarrassment for Putin. The Orange Revolution in Ukraine was happening at around the same time as the Rose Revolution in Georgia, and the expansion of NATO to include Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Slovakia, Slovenia, Romania, and Bulgaria. Putin clearly saw all this as an example of the United States working against him.
Так как в ее основе нет и не может быть.
As he complained in a landmark speech to the Munich Security Conference in 2007.
Думаю, очевидно, процесс натовского расширения не имеет никакого отношения к модернизации самого Альянса, и у нас есть справедливое право откровенно спросить, против кого это расширение.
Former Canadian Foreign Minister Peter MacKay was at that meeting.
He was somehow the victim. Russia was wronged by the West. And I was at that conference, and I remember sort of looking around at other people who I knew in the room and sort of saying, what's this all about? Is this leading somewhere, or is this just the aggrieved president of Russia?
Is evidence of somebody who's conspiracy-minded, but it's also good politics for Putin and his like in Russia, because it explains their reverses in one country after another. It's not in that explanation a rejection of Russia. It's a conspiracy by the U.S.
Viktor Yushchenko was not the last Putin opponent to be poisoned.
My name is Alexander Litvinenko. I am former KGB and FSB officer.
Alexander Litvinenko was a KGB agent who had actually met with Putin when he was named head of the spy service, and had appealed to Putin to reform the organization. When that did not happen, Litvinenko and other officers held a press conference accusing Putin's secret police of murdering people. Litvinenko was charged with crimes but acquitted, and he fled to London, England with his family. Back home in Russia, Litvinenko had now become a kind of traitor poster boy for Vladimir Putin's secret police. They used his photograph for target practice. Putin himself had always been very clear about what should happen to Russian traitors.
А вы умеете прощать?
Да. Но не все.
А что невозможно простить?
Предательство.
In November 2006, at the Millennium Hotel in London, Alexander Litvinenko was invited to a business meeting with two former KGB agents who were visiting the city, Dmitry Kovtun and Andrei Lugovoy. There were hotel security photographs of all three. At a rendezvous in the hotel bar, Litvinenko was served tea that was spiked with radioactive polonium-210. Litvinenko suffered an agonizing decline over several days. He allowed this photograph to be taken, and he issued a statement that he had no doubt that Vladimir Putin had ordered his death.
Александр Литвиненко не является носителем вообще никаких секретов. Все, что он мог сказать негативного в отношении своей службы, где он раньше работал, он же давно сказал.
Litvinenko died after 3 weeks of agony. At the funeral, his radioactive body was buried in a lead-lined coffin. He left a young son, Anatoly, and his wife, Marina.
It's not only my story, it's a story of Russia and how Russia has changed for all this period of time and how many other people have been killed. And I believe all responsibilities is on the Russian government, and a man who is responsible for all of what happened to Russia now, it's Mr. Putin himself.
Sergei Magnitsky would become another prominent victim of the Putin regime. Magnitsky acted as a lawyer for the businessman Bill Browder. Browder was expelled from Russia in 2005. Then the offices of his Russian lawyers were raided by the police. Documents and corporate seals seized in the raid were used to falsely re-register his $200 million companies. Magnitsky, a fun-loving young family man, documented the theft of Browder's companies and publicly identified the government officials responsible. He was arrested and then murdered in prison.
He was killed on November 16th, 2009. I got the news the next morning, and it was the most horrifying, traumatic, life-changing news I could have ever gotten. He was effectively killed because he worked for me. If Sergei hadn't been my lawyer, he'd still be alive today. And when I was able to sort of get through the fog of hysteria and heartbreak to think clearly, I made a vow to his memory, to his family, and to myself that I was going to put aside everything else I was doing in my life and devote all of my time, energy, and resources going after the people who killed him to make sure they face justice. And for the last 15 years, that's what I've been doing.
Mr. Browder has traveled from overseas to be here today to testify about the...
Browder campaigned in the U.S. Congress and in parliaments around the world to bring in strict new sanctions for Russian officials accused of human rights abuses. Many governments passed such laws, named for Sergei Magnitsky. Those laws especially aggravated Vladimir Putin, who blamed Browder.
Деловые партнеры господина Браудера.
By 2010, Putin had been credibly accused of responsibility for the deaths of Alexander Litvinenko, Sergei Magnitsky, and thousands of civilians in the city of Grozny, Chechnya.
I found my
And yet when he held a charity party in Russia, he was enthusiastically applauded and cheered by an audience of invited Western movie stars, including Goldie Hawn and Kurt Russell, Kevin Costner, and Sharon Stone.
My dreams came true.
Putin could see that Western countries had short memories and attention spans, and that Western leaders weren't about to stop him. Many believe that the personal relationships of world leaders have a lot to do with how history unfolds. And Vladimir Putin's 25-year interaction with foreign leaders provides a fascinating case study of that theory. He recently invited India's Narendra Modi to a private dinner at his home, and Modi proclaimed himself very touched by the gesture. China's Xi Jinping has called Putin his best friend. And at the 2024 BRICS summit, Putin said that his friendships provided the basis for a new world order. In the past, his adversaries got a different treatment. There was evidence Putin played psychological games with foreign leaders like German Chancellor Angela Merkel. In this 2007 meeting, the Russian president brought in his large Labrador dog.
It's that classic KGB mindset. Everyone knew that Angela Merkel was terrified of dogs. She had a phobia of dogs. Putin knew that probably better than most. He is well briefed. He knows what people's buttons are and he pushes them.
He evidently wants to dominate all the time. He wants to prove that he's the toughest guy in the room. He always has to have someone to humiliate.
It speaks to a dark nature, a character flaw in that man that crosses all lines in terms of diplomacy and just human nature.
Former French President François Hollande was also struck by Putin's psychological tactics in their personal meetings.
C'est pas un hasard s'il a été formé au KGB. Le KGB, c'est ça, c'est je vous menace et je vous emmène aussi dans une relation presque personnelle. Toujours pour avoir deux fers au feu. Je vous menace, mais je suis prêt à la discussion.
In 2008, Putin was prevented by constitutional term limits to run again for the presidency, and so he temporarily stepped aside and allowed his longtime assistant, Dmitry Medvedev, to take the job. Putin was appointed prime minister.
He takes the Medvedev as his chair-warming person. I remember my joke was at the time is that Russia is so patriarchal that even our first lady is a man. So whatever Medvedev is doing is only he's on a long leash or a short leash, but it's a leash.
The U.S. government misread the situation. They thought Putin's power had been eclipsed, and they could now deal directly with the seemingly more liberal Medvedev. In a clumsy maneuver, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton presented Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov with a button to symbolically reset relations with the U.S., but mistranslated the word reset in Russian.
The Americans, the Obama administration, fell into the kind of naive trap that they could build up Medvedev, who, by the way, is a very short man, and push down on Putin, and that would work as a strategy. It was never going to work, and it was extraordinary that they even pursued it.
While Dmitry Medvedev was filling in as president of Russia, the Middle East went through a period of upheaval. The Arab Spring in 2011 swept away dictatorships in Tunisia and Egypt, and then focused on the longtime Russian client state of Libya. As Western powers moved to aid the uprising against dictator Muammar Gaddafi, President Medvedev decided to stand aside and not interfere. Gaddafi was tracked down by angry mobs as he tried to flee, dragged out of a sewer pipe and murdered in front of the cameras. This was reportedly a very important moment for Vladimir Putin, who watched the videotape of this moment over and over. He became determined that he should not share the same eventual fate.
I think that was a key and seminal moment for him where he decided that he was going to do everything he could to crush any sort of opposition in Russia so that there was never any danger of a popular uprising coming for him in the same way that it had come for Gaddafi.
Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin.
In another fixed election in 2012, an apparently emotional Putin took the Russian presidency back from Dmitry Medvedev. In his new term, he clearly decided to be much more aggressive with Western countries, something that became apparent in his first private meeting with then French President François Hollande. Putin complained about being surrounded by NATO missiles installed in Europe.
Et il a demandé, ce qui est assez rare dans un entretien entre chefs d'État, d'avoir un papier et sur lequel il a dessiné une carte de l'Europe et il a mis les missiles qui étaient disposés sur la partie centrale de l'Europe et qui menaçaient directement sa sécurité. Il voulait déjà jouer les victimes, c'est-à-dire l'agresser, comme pour mieux justifier ensuite ce qu'il aurait peut-être à faire pour soi-disant se défendre.
Putin would soon go on the attack in Syria, where he had long supported the dictator Bashar al-Assad. In the civil war there, the US President Barack Obama said it would be a red line if chemical weapons were used by Russia or their Syrian regime allies. When chemical weapons were in fact employed, as all the world could see from TV images of children choking to death, once again the Western world did almost nothing.
Le fait que nous n'ayons pas puni Bachar el-Assad au moment où il a utilisé les armes chimiques et que Obama finit par renoncer à l'opération a été pour Poutine aussi un moyen de continuer à faire ses opérations aussi bien au Moyen-Orient qu'en Ukraine.
By 2013, Putin indeed turned his attention back to Ukraine and tried to force the pro-Russian President Viktor Yanukovych to cancel a proposed new treaty with Europe. Just like the Orange Revolution, the majority pro-Western population rebelled, and again the Maidan Square was filled with anti-Russian protesters, egged on by European and American politicians.
People of Ukraine, this is your moment.
Yanukovych tried to put down the Maidan protest with police violence and bullets. The demonstrators held their ground. The Putin-backed President Yanukovych fled the country on a helicopter in the dead of night.
Putin saw Ukraine as a part of Russia, and he saw Euromaidan as essentially the first part of a potential uprising that could eventually end in him being removed from power. So it was unacceptable to him that Euromaidan had swept in and that these protests had removed his man from the job.
There were joyous celebrations in Kyiv, but Putin was plotting his revenge. He had decided to break up Ukraine by seizing the Crimean Peninsula in the south and the majority Russian-speaking areas in the east of the country. He deployed to Crimea an army of Russian soldiers without any markings on their uniforms, who became known as the Little Green Men. When he was asked about them, Putin lied and said they had nothing to do with Russia. Russian soldiers and Russian-backed separatists began attacking Ukraine's army in the eastern Russian-speaking areas of the Donbass. Garry Kasparov was the longtime world chess champion who gave up chess to work in opposition to Vladimir Putin's regime. He was arrested numerous times. He saw Putin's Crimea move as a key turning point.
That was the best way for the way Putin saw it, to tell the West that, you know, he's no longer playing by the rules. So annexing territory is just, it's a very important element of destroying the world order. But dictators, they're opportunists. Even Hitler was opportunist, or Stalin. They had ideology, but still opportunity. This is what made them really strong. So smell it, grab it, attack.
Once again, the Western response to Putin's action seemed weak. Putin was still invited to the June 2014 70th anniversary commemorations of the Normandy invasion in France. He was greeted as an honored guest by French President François Hollande. The new pro-Western Ukrainian president Petro Poroshenko was also there.
Et pour moi, comme pour Merkel, inviter Poutine, dès lors que Poroshenko, le président ukrainien, était également invité, c'était obliger Poutine à reconnaître la légitimité du nouveau président ukrainien et pour trouver une solution à ce premier conflit ukrainien.
Putin did agree to have a brief meeting with Poroshenko away from the cameras. The Ukrainian president knew what he was up against.
I have several recommendations, those who have a plan to meet with Putin. Point number one, don't trust Putin. Putin is a KGB officer who specially learned to lie. Second, please don't be afraid of Putin. Because if you're afraid of Putin, this is feeding him. And Putin go as far as we together allow him to go.
At a G20 meeting a few months later in Australia, in contrast to previous Western passivity, then Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper tried a tough approach.
Vladimir Putin came into this private session with other world leaders and went immediately to our Prime Minister, Stephen Harper, who had been quite vocal about Putin and in his obvious plans for Crimea. And he made a beeline for him, put his hand out, to which, you know, Prime Minister Harper then looked at him and said, "You need to get out of Crimea." And Putin said, "We're not in Crimea." That was the beginning of the end for Russia's participation in the G8, because everybody in the room knew that he was lying.
It became clear that Putin basically didn't care what the leaders of Western democratic countries said or did.
He thinks that Western leaders are gullible and short-lived. They're sort of colourful butterflies that flutter around for a bit and then get wiped out when winter comes in. Whereas Putin, whom we know has outlasted or is close to outlasting Stalin, doesn't have to worry about pesky things like elections, and he knows what he'll be doing in 2 years' time, 4 years' time.
While Putin has been very open about his dealings with foreign leaders, he has been very secretive about his private life. Putin has always kept his personal life very private, and so Russians were surprised in 2013 when he and wife Lyudmila casually strolled over to a camera after a ballet performance and announced they were divorcing.
В общем, это общее решение.
Putin said it was a mutual decision, that they had simply grown apart because he was so busy.
Слава Владимира Владимировича, это действительно было нашим общим решением.
Hello, I'm Alina Kabaeva. Welcome.
Behind the decision was his years-long relationship with a much younger woman that he had tried to hide. Alina Kabaeva had come to fame as a Russian gymnast who won gold medals in international competitions. Putin met her when he handed out one of those medals. Even after she was suspended from international competitions because she was caught using banned steroids and other substances, Her relationship with Putin deepened.
За Владимира Владимировича Путина.
She actually became a member of the Duma parliament for Putin's United Russia party. Then she dropped out of sight for a few years, in which she was reported to have become pregnant and given birth to several Putin children. Putin was actually asked about his relationship to Kabayeva on a 2008 visit to his friend Silvio Berlusconi, the Italian prime minister.
Я всегда отрицательно относился к тем, кто с каким-то гриппозным носом и со своими эротическими фантазиями лезет в чужую жизнь.
The Moscow newspaper that reported the Putin-Kabayeva relationship was immediately shut down. Putin has been equally secretive about his two grown daughters from his first marriage, both of whom have amassed vast fortunes.
The whole mentality of the current regime in the Kremlin has its roots back in the Soviet KGB. It's this secret mentality that everything has to be sort of behind closed doors. Nothing will be revealed to the public.
The popular Russian opposition leader Alexei Navalny was effective at winning a younger generation to the anti-Putin side. Putin's private life and incredible wealth became a major target for him. In a film called Putin's Palace, Navalny documented how many Putin pals from his St. Petersburg days had become fabulously wealthy, and how many of them had streamed millions of dollars into building his giant opulent home constructed on a prime location overlooking the Black Sea. In addition to fabulous gardens and helicopter pads, the palace would include a private arena where Putin could indulge one of his favorite hobbies, hockey. Russians were very familiar with Putin's devotion to hockey. They had seen him playing in games with former Russian NHL stars, where he had somehow been able to score at least 5 goals.
The audience of that film about Putin's Palace was bigger than the audience of Russian state television channels. That sort of showed to millions of people in Russia the true nature of this regime that sort of purports to be this sort of patriotic government looking out for Russia's national interests, but is in fact just a bunch of aging KGB officers who want to steal as much as they can.
After the 2014 invasion of Crimea, it was becoming more and more dangerous to be an opposition figure in Russia. There were some anti-war demonstrations led by one of the most popular opposition politicians in the country, Boris Nemtsov. Nemtsov was arrested numerous times, but he persisted in his denunciations of Putin that seemed to be gathering momentum.
Boris couldn't accept the fact that the country was in the hands of this criminal, just this lousy. I mean, it was like a physical contempt. And I think it was vice versa. I think that Putin also sensed that Boris was just different. Look at Putin. This is a dwarf, midget, and Boris Nemtsov, the strong man.
In February 2015, a stunning crime. Boris Nemtsov was gunned down on a bridge right in front of the Kremlin as he walked home from work.
They just found the easiest way to deal with him. It was a shocking effect, but surprise, I don't think even he was surprised. I think it's just, again, I'm sure he knew he was doomed, but he just didn't want to show weakness.
The opponents of the Putin regime began receiving attacks with an iodine-like green dye called Zelyonka. Alexei Navalny was hit several times, along with journalists and opposition political figures, including Putin's former prime minister, Mikhail Kasyanov.
There was a number of such signals to me that I should stop that activity. Boris Nemtsov was killed. I was under pressure just to give me an understanding that I could be next.
The threats got more intense. Kasyanov, along with Vladimir Karamurza, were featured in a sniper video on the Instagram page of one of Putin's allies. Karamurza was poisoned twice, once in 2015 and again in 2017. He was hospitalized in a coma that lasted for days, but he survived. Then in 2020, Alexei Navalny was poisoned with a toxic radioactive substance called Novichok. He barely survived and was flown out to Germany for medical treatment. As he recuperated in Germany, he set out to document how such poisonings were carried out.
Я знаю, кто хотел меня убить. Я знаю, где они живут. Я знаю, где они работают.
With the help of investigative journalists at the Bellingcat organization, Navalny was able to show in astonishing detail how he had been followed around by Russian secret agents for months before he had been poisoned.
It's just something that a normal human mind cannot process. But it is the reality of Vladimir Putin's Russia that there is a government-operated death squad inside the security services, the main task of which, the only task of which, is to physically eliminate political opponents of the current Russian government.
After his embarrassing revelations about Putin's poison squad, in 2021, Alexei Navalny decided to return to Russia, even though he was sure to face imprisonment there. As a citizen of Russia, he says, I have the absolute right to return home. There was a debate about whether it was a courageous or foolhardy decision. He was arrested at the airport on arrival, gave his wife a last kiss goodbye, and then was given one prison sentence after another on a long series of charges. With his major critics silenced, in July 2021, Putin started to prepare the ground for his invasion of Ukraine, echoing his words of 30 years before. It began with an astonishing 5,000-word personal essay in Russian newspapers that reviewed 1,000 years of Russian history, from the time of Saint Vladimir, founder of the Russian Orthodox Church. The modern Vladimir strongly argued that all Russian speakers were part of one great nation, and suggested that Ukraine was not a real country, even that the Ukrainian language was not a real language.
I thought it was an indication that he had a very different course planned both for Russia and for Ukraine. It may be important to note that he sent that article to every soldier in the Russian army. So he intended this view of history and this kind of paranoid, nostalgic, imperialist view of the past to be the ideology of the modern Russian army.
Западные коллеги предпочитают этого не замечать.
Immediately before the invasion came the angry Putin speech that put a similar message in a much more threatening manner.
Вся ответственность за возможное продолжение кровопролития будет целиком и полностью на совести правящего на территории Украины режима.
The anger at Ukraine is the anger at a country that has successfully overcome exactly the kind of autocratic kleptocracy that he has in Russia, and Putin is afraid that Russians will make that kind of decision in Russia. He wants to eliminate Ukraine as a country and as a democracy. That's what threatens him, is the idea of sovereignty, the idea of freedom, and the idea of democracy for Ukraine.
As Putin surrounded Ukraine with armored divisions and prepared his invasion, Western leaders like France's Emmanuel Macron and Germany's Olaf Scholz traveled to Moscow to try to talk him out of military action.
Это же было.
He rebuffed their efforts.
Le grand malentendu entre les Européens et Poutine, et plus largement les Occidentaux et Poutine, c'est que les Européens ne veulent pas faire la guerre. Pour eux, la guerre est une histoire terrible, celle du XXe siècle, et qu'il n'y a aucune raison de penser la guerre aujourd'hui comme possible sur le continent. Alors que pour Poutine, la guerre est possible. C'est ça le malentendu. Nous sommes des nations pacifiques, démocratiques, qui n'aimons pas la mort, alors que pour Poutine, la mort fait partie de l'action.
When Putin launched his full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it didn't go as planned. Russia's latest invasion of Ukraine began in the early hours of February 24th with a barrage of rocket and missile attacks. On that first day, hundreds of Russian tanks crossed into Ukraine. The tanks attacked from Crimea in the south towards the city of Kherson, from the east towards the city of Kharkiv, and from the north down towards the capital, Kyiv. The tank columns were stopped in their tracks. The Ukrainians used Western-supplied Javelin and other anti-tank missiles to target them. Putin clearly expected to capture or kill the Ukrainian president, Volodymyr Zelensky, or that he would flee in terror. Instead, Zelensky announced that he and his government were staying in place to lead the resistance.
Slava Ukraini!
Ukrainian civilians armed themselves to fight back against Vladimir Putin. The Guardian's Luke Harding has covered the war from the beginning.
There's a paradox at the heart of this story. Putin thinks he's a brilliant spy, and he was told by Russia's intelligence agencies that Ukrainians would welcome Russian troops and cheer them, applaud them as they came in on tanks. And in fact, they fought back big time, and Putin pretty quickly discovered that he was not battling against a sort of small, unpopular, corrupt pro-Western government of Volodymyr Zelensky, but fighting an entire nation of about 40 million people.
In the early days of the invasion, there were a handful of anti-war demonstrations across Russia, but they were mercilessly crushed by Putin's police. All independent media in Russia was shut down by the government. All that remained were government-controlled propaganda TV programs where the hosts had promised a quick victory.
Понимали, что в горячей войне мы Украину победим за 2 дня.
И Киев будет взят так быстро, 1,5-3 дня.
2 дня, а потом падение города.
Пропаганда — это все вранье. Нет, пропаганда всегда готовит население к чему-нибудь.
For many years, Dmitry Muratov ran the main independent Russian newspaper, Novaya Gazeta.
8 лет наша пропаганда по телевидению в России твердила о том, что Украина — это не государство, это не народ, и это одни фашисты. Они что, врали? Конечно. Но они готовили население к тому, что может состояться то, что произошло. И подготовили.
In the early days of the war, it was still possible to find dissenting voices in the streets of Moscow.
Потому что эта война не спецоперация, вероломное нападение на соседние государства, бесстыдное.
Now that is much more difficult. The CBC was expelled from Russia shortly after the invasion, but we were able to gather a few young people together to carefully share their views of Putin, the only leader they have ever known.
I fully trust our Mr. Putin, and I fully trust the government structures. And I definitely support all the things that are happening in Russia currently.
Я считаю искренне то, что Путин — это не суперзлодей из мультиков, которого просто вот задача всех затравить, загнобить и стать самым влиятельным.
Russia recently announced a change in school history textbooks. Gone are any criticisms of the Soviet past. Instead, there are glowing endorsements of the words and actions of Vladimir Putin.
You've got textbooks being changed, you've got children being taught to hate the West, to view the West as an aberration, and you've got a complete whitewashing of history on Putin's behalf, where he has essentially literally rewritten history.
Documentary filmmaker Vitaly Mansky has revisited the early uncritical film he made about Putin. He now sees all Russians as complicit in Putin's march to dictatorship. He has entitled his documentary, Putin's Witnesses.
Поэтому все в России считают, что они свидетели Путина, а я считаю, что все мы, и я в том числе, являемся соучастниками путинских преступлений.
Putin has a number of major advantages in his fight against Ukraine. With a far larger population, he has sent millions of young men into the battle. and can avoid the normal media coverage when, according to NATO, over 700,000 have become casualties. Then there are nuclear weapons. Russia has the world's largest collection. When Putin announced the Ukraine invasion, he also made a show of instructing his military commanders to place the Russian nuclear forces on alert. Putin gave a chilling pre-war interview about the prospect of nuclear war.
Для мира будет глобальная катастрофа. Но я все-таки как гражданин России и глава российского государства, тогда хочу задаться вопросом, а зачем нам такой мир, если там не будет России?
Putin's threats brought a wave of speculation about his mental state, about whether he is unbalanced enough to use a nuclear device. Ambassador John Bolton negotiated with Putin about nuclear weapons. He says the man he knew then was not crazy.
I think he's about as cold-blooded as you could get. He would say in English sometimes, well, you have your logic, we'll have ours, we'll see which one prevails. But I don't think he's a fanatic in that respect, and I think if you overstate your concern about whether, for example, he'd resort to nuclear weapons, he wins just by bluff.
Putin has explicitly stated he is not bluffing.
Для защиты России и нашего народа мы, безусловно, используем все имеющиеся в нашем распоряжении средства. Это не блеф.
Russian newspaper editor Dmitry Muratov was a co-winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2023. He is not so sure Putin's nuclear threats can be discounted.
На сегодняшний день судьба планеты впервые в истории человечества зависит от одного пальца одного человека.
The Americans have warned Putin that there would be a catastrophic military response if he used any nuclear weapon.
He's never going to do it because Moscow would be a parking lot. And Putin is a lot of things, and there's lots of adjectives to describe him. But he's not crazy in the true sense that he doesn't want to survive. He's not suicidal.
What role will Donald Trump play in this tug of war? It has become apparent that he wants to pressure Ukrainian President Zelensky to accept a peace deal in which Russia gets to hold on to the Ukrainian territories it has conquered, and Ukraine gets some kind of extra security guarantees from the West to prevent Russia from invading again. Polls show Ukrainians are ready to make a deal.
Now, a majority of Ukrainians favor an end to the conflict, even if it doesn't mean the restoration of the territories. If the United States can force a deal, I think the Ukrainian side will go along.
Потом это не перемирие, это прекращение огня. Дальше пускай встречаются делегации, пускай они определяют статусы земель, регионов. Прекращение огня не означает признание завоеванных земель. Внимание!
On the Russian side, there is very little pressure on Putin to make a deal, especially because all opposition to him has been wiped out. During his 2 years in prison, Alexei Navalny continued his spirited resistance to Putin until his sudden death was announced in February 2024. Small crowds of brave people attended memorial demonstrations for him, but his death was a serious blow to the opposition movements in Russia. Like Navalny, Vladimir Kara-Murza had been arrested and sentenced to 25 years for his opposition to the war.
God bless him.
He was released in a prisoner exchange in August 2024 and has gone on to meet many Western leaders in his ongoing campaign of opposition to Vladimir Putin. He fights alongside Navalny's widow, Yulia.
I have absolutely no doubt on this as a historian myself. Vladimir Putin will be remembered in history in the same line of names as Hitler and Stalin and Mussolini. That's exactly the type of tyrant that he is. A tyrant that
back where we were at the beginning of the Cold War. We're back to containment, where there's no point in trying to understand Russia. The answer is simply to contain.
Crisis. Russia will have to live for generations, rebuilding itself, redeeming itself, recouping at least bits and pieces of trust of not only the world community, but of its own people.
8 years before he became Russian president, Vladimir Putin outlined his belief that